So, welcome to the Invicta Vita podcast. I'm honored to have Raghav Parkash here with me today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's an honor to have you. You are an elite coach. You coach some extremely high performing individuals. And I want to talk to you today about imposter syndrome. I think you know this topic better than most people. You've even written a book about it. So I'm going to throw that term in, imposter syndrome. Can you explain to our audience what it is? What does it actually mean? And how do you actually deal with it? How do you conquer it?
Perfect. Yeah. It's such a juicy conversation. And I think, well, one of the reasons I love it is there's a lot of misunderstanding around it. And I think it's been blown up out of proportion. Even the fact that we call it imposter syndrome itself is something I don't like. That I don't think it's a syndrome. I don't think it deserves such a big title that when I hear that, I think imposter syndrome, wow, that sounds really big. It sounds very fancy schmancy. It sounds like a clinical term. And what we've done through language is we've overcooked something that I think is actually relatively normal. So even though it's imposter syndrome, everyone listen. We'll talk about imposter syndrome. Everyone listening in will relate and think, "I've never called it imposter syndrome, but I do experience those symptoms." So what we're talking about is a very common phenomenon that it impacts 70% of people in society consciously. That's just those who know about it. Then there's the 30% who experience it, but then have never given it those words because it's not commonly spoken about. So, what is this thing called imposter syndrome? Well, without using the title, the most basic explanation I have to date is when you're doing something in your life and you think you as an individual are not good enough. So, you question who you are and your own capabilities. So, it's like imagining if you think of an Indiana Jones scenario where there's like the bridge that you want to cross and there's this destination you want to get to, but it looks like I'm over here and this massive chasm in between who I am and who I need to be on the other side. So I'm like, typically where this shows up is a number of leaders and entrepreneurs I coach. I want to build this X business, but am I the person to do that? Am I the person who could be good enough to do that?
Yeah.
Do I have the qualifications to do it? What if I'm not skilled enough? And it doesn't actually look like self-doubt. It looks really genuine to the person who's experiencing it, that no, I'm not qualified enough. I even had this earlier today with someone I was coaching, that it doesn't even seem like a doubt. It's just I don't have the qualifications and skills. So that's essentially what that is. And that's why I say it's not a syndrome, that every athlete, every singer, every artist, anyone who's worth their salt, when they get into the arena, they will have those same thoughts. What if I'm not good enough? What if, etc. Now, there's a way of addressing it and working with it, but everyone who has ever achieved anything worthwhile will experience those symptoms. So, as a possibility, imposter syndrome it's not a syndrome, it's a commonality. It's a symptom of being human. So, that's how I look at it.
So, really, what you're saying is it's not necessarily tied to experience or mental health, even. It's actually tied to performance. And even some of the most experienced, established people can suffer from it.
Oh, 100%. That you will get a few percent of society that I know people like this. They're incredible performers. They will get onto the stage, the dance floor, the artist canvas, the microphone if you're a singer, whatever your field of performance is, and they won't have that experience running through their mind. And that's fine. Those are the far and the few, right? It's not common. Whereas most people in society, if you look at the Howard Schultzes of the world, the guy who founded Starbucks, if you look at Meryl Streep, if you look at even Tom Cruise, all these people who perform at this, it's like such a high level, especially Tom Cruise. I'm a huge fan of the guy and the way he pushes himself all the time. And someone asked him, don't you ever get scared? Don't you ever doubt yourself and question yourself? And he says all the time, but I don't mind getting scared. I've just learned not to mind being that fearful or feeling those feelings. That's the only thing that's changed for him in the game. So there's tactics to things you can do to navigate imposter syndrome. But a big part of it that crumbles all the worry and stress people have around it is that it's not a bad thing. It's not an issue. It's not a personal flaw. It's not you as an individual have something wrong with you. It's just a reflection of the way the mind is built to keep you safe, to protect you. And it's a normal inbuilt human instinct.
Yeah, that makes complete sense, actually. As you say, it's not a syndrome. And I think we have batted that around for a long time. And so people have actually associated that with a mental health condition. And what you've just explained is it affects some of the top performers, some of the most successful people that we look at on our screens and think, wow, haven't they got it all? So, really, all humans go through it at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think I've ever met or coached any leader, anyone who's ever done anything extraordinary. It doesn't matter what field they're in, whether it's banking, whether it's finance, whether it's the retail sector, any industry you can imagine, any athlete, even the Cristiano Ronaldos of the world. In my opinion, he's not just the best footballer, but he's one of the most mentally strongest people on the planet. Like he's someone I admire from a mental discipline point of view. And even he speaks about that he gets nervous and sometimes questions himself.
Mm-mm-mm.
So if this is what we see at the most elite level, then actually this is what people up to anything big go through.
Yeah.
Right? Anyone doing something exciting, they're going to come across these symptoms. In fact, I almost say that if I do something and I don't experience imposter syndrome, I get bored. I get really bored. I look for imposter syndrome.
So you want that discomfort in a way because it helps you grow.
I see it as I'm pushing my comfort zone.
Yeah.
Like one of the coaches that I've learned a lot from and I really love, he's created this container and he says imposter syndrome is the invite. It's what you have to have to be in this room, that you're playing that game that actually scares you. So people who come in feel imposter syndrome because you're surrounded by all these other high performers. And he says that, I can't remember the exact expression, but he says that's the bare minimum. That's the bar. That's the invite. That we want people who feel that edge because we're going to push and challenge our comfort zone. And that's all that is.
Yeah.
That I'm about to grow. I'm about to do something different. I'm about to expand as a human being. And I love that.
Yeah.
For me, I've seen that that's what that is. So I purposefully chase that and seek it out.
Yeah. I know we've spoken about cultural differences as well amongst children. So, like American children versus British children.
Yeah, coming into this conversation, it's something I was really curious about. I speak to a lot of people about it, and I wonder what your take is. That if we look at, for example, the UK, I see this sort of humble type of culture, and it's really evident. And one of my clients in dentistry was talking to me about this today, saying, why is it that there's such a shift? Like in the US, you'll see that there's a lot more confidence, there's a lot more outspokenness. So I have a take on that, but I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And it's actually something I noticed from very early on, having been to an international school where I had a lot of American friends, and then coming to the UK for my education, and then having a lot of British friends, and seeing the differences from sort of very early on. And what it is in the American culture, children from a very young age are taught to be very proactive. They're taught that being proud of their achievements is something that is essential. It's celebrated. Every win is actually talked about in the home and celebrated as a positive. And then when you come to the UK and you see British people, a lot of the times, and I see this with some of my clients, when I say to them in a mock interview, describe your proudest moment or what's your greatest achievement, they get really uncomfortable. And I even had a few clients tell me that their parents said that such a question was very boastful, and it's almost seen as a negative, and it's seen as a form of arrogance to talk about achievements as opposed to celebrating them. And now when you go into the working world and you effectively have to sell yourself because you're trying to get that job that thousands of other people want, you have to be a little bit proud. And that's not to say you're being arrogant, but it's actually telling them what you have achieved and showing them that sense of pride. And so I think culturally, the two cultures don't celebrate it in the same way. So you have one culture where they are actually taught something called show and tell, where they come into the classroom and they talk and they're exposed to public speaking from a very young age. And then you have a different culture where there's less public speaking, there's less talk about these achievements. And therefore, what happens is you get people in their 20s when they're going for these job interviews who don't really know how to sell themselves adequately because they've been told that that's an arrogance and it's almost got a negative connotation. What's your take on it?
I like everything you said, because it speaks to me and what I experienced when I was a young child going through school. That I think they call it tall poppy syndrome or something like that, where you don't want to stand out.
Mm.
So in society, anyone previously, and if you think about our history and where we've come from, if you stood out, that would be a really bad thing. So we've been told, keep to yourself, don't celebrate, don't talk about your successes, be humble. But that advice has become an overcorrection. So in society today, when we tend to do things, we tend to overcorrect, like as an example. And that's what I've seen here. Whereas in the US, you spoke about show and tell. So from a young age, culturally, it's fantastic. Is talk about things, but talk about it from a point of celebration. You're celebrating your success. You're celebrating the journey. It's not just the wins, but an overall celebration. I think Sarah Blakely spoke about it. She's one of my favorite people, the youngest female self-made billionaire. And her dad used to help her celebrate everything, not just your wins, but where did you fail today? That was a question he would ask her every day at the dinner table. Where did you fail? So it's learning to have that way of looking at the world where you celebrate every moment.
Mm.
And that's why there's this empowerment culture in the US where they celebrate success. And I'd love to see that come here, because the impact on every level of society would be massive. That imagine you've got the next generation of leaders that are kids that are championing each other, championing themselves, celebrating success, output, productivity, high level achievement. That then becomes the norm, and you build on that and build on that. So it's only a good thing, which sadly we've shied away a lot from over the years.
No, I completely agree with you. And if I were to get a little bit personal now with you, can you talk to me about a time when you didn't feel good enough, where this sort of imposter syndrome got to you? Can you share that with our audience?
Yeah, you asked that question, how long have you got? There's so many places I can think of in my life where I've had that thought. I think most recently it would be politics. So when I was entering the world of politics, it's an area that I absolutely love. And I remember the first thought that I had, I was actually on a tour of Parliament, and I spoke to the guide at the time.
Mm.
And we went inside it's the other house, I've forgotten the name now, it slipped my mind. But it's where their offices are. It's connected to the House of the Parliament. And we were attending a talk, and I said to this guide, I haven't been to Oxford or Cambridge. Am I able to go to politics? And I even took him aside because I didn't want anyone hearing this. And I said to him really softly, I haven't been to Oxford and Cambridge. Can I go into politics? And he didn't understand what I was saying because he was so confused by the question. He said, what do you mean?
Yeah.
I said, well, you know the University of Oxford? He said, yes, quite well, actually. I studied there. I'm like, yes, that one. I said, I haven't been there. Can I go into politics? And he said, I don't understand the link. What do you mean? Can I?
Mm.
And he eventually got the question saying, oh, I get what you mean. He says, no, you don't have to study there to be in politics.
Mm.
So I've had traces of that.
Mm.
Even when I wanted to run as a council candidate, I remember hearing this voice in my head that said, who are you to do that? Who are you to be a politician? So I used to have this voice all the time in my head. And the only thing that changed as I became a coach 14 years ago, that when I noticed this voice in my mind, it was a couple of years back, I've learned to not take it seriously, because that voice isn't a truth. It's not something that is a reflection of the world. It's just a thought that I'm having in the moment.
Mm.
So I still experience it randomly to date, but it's a lot less serious. Yeah, a lot less heavier on how I feel day to day. So I have it there, but I can function without.
Yeah.
But I'd love to flip the script, because you've asked me the question, and I think you're an extraordinary human being. I tell all my family about you. I rave about you. That Gigi is one of the most talented women I've ever come across. So there must be pockets of society and times that you've experienced this, I'm sure. I'd love to hear your version.
Wow, that's so sweet. Thank you so much. That means a lot to me. And I was so honored to actually meet your family at your wedding recently. So thank you so much for
No, I
having
mean
me
that.
there.
I'm a huge fan of you. And I tell everyone that you're one of the most remarkable, extraordinary, talented, and also grounded high performers I've seen. And I know that because you must have been through stuff like this before.
Yeah, I definitely have had moments in my journey where I've felt that self-doubt and really questioned, am I good enough to be here? And particularly since launching Invicta Vita, which I launched 2 years ago, as you know. Prior to that, I was in the banking industry, as you know, for 14 years. And being an entrepreneur, it takes a certain type of individual. And I think, as you know, you go through a lot of highs, but a lot of lows as well. And the most recent time I experienced this sort of imposter syndrome, or to not call it imposter syndrome, self doubt, was the first time I was asked to speak on a panel, actually. So usually I tend to host the panels and I will interview guests on different topics. And I love interviewing guests, as you know. But I was actually asked to be on this panel, and there were these amazing entrepreneurs on it who'd done amazing things and achieved such incredible things and had such remarkable journeys. And I remember reading all their CVs and their bios, and I just thought, oh my goodness, these people are incredible. Like, am I good enough to be on this panel? Am I good enough to actually go up and talk? And I felt incredibly honored to have been asked, but at the same time, I was questioning, am I good enough? Have I done enough to be up there? And it was incredibly rewarding for me um, when I had so many people asking me questions from the audience whilst I was on the panel. And then I had a lot of people come and speak to me after the talk, asking me questions about my journey, asking for advice. And so that really meant a lot to me. And it helped reassure me in that I was enough, and that the fact that someone asks you to be on a panel means they actually think you're adding value. And actually, what was really beautiful is there was another woman who was actually working in the banking industry, and she was going through a really, really rough time. She was in tears actually when she was asking me her question. And the fact that she connected so much with my story meant a lot to me, but it also meant that there might be other women who would connect with that same story, who would want to hear from me. So I think it's easy for us to feel that self doubt, but it's knowing that if someone asks you to show up and be there and tell your story, own it. Be proud of your story, be open, and be receptive.
So it makes me curious about this. I'd love to get your take. And one of the most coolest things I love sharing about you when people say, who's Gigi, is your amazing rise in finance and what you've done as one of the most incredible performers in the bank at the time, and all the amazing accolades we could talk about. What I found when I was doing the imposter syndrome research is people kept highlighting a difference between how men and women experience it. Now, as a coach, when I've coached women and men, at the time I thought, okay, the symptoms are the same. We all experience imposter syndrome, but there's sometimes a way we relate to it differently. So there's this idea out there that when things don't necessarily go as well for men and they experience imposter syndrome, they'll blame events. So men handle it very differently. They'll blame the event, they'll blame the circumstance, they'll blame it's something outside beyond me. Whereas a number of the women that I spoke to experience imposter syndrome wouldn't actually blame what's outside, they'd blame themselves. So they'd take it on a little bit harder. I'm curious what your take is on that and how you think it impact men and women differently.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And in my experience, I definitely tend to agree with that research when I look at friends of mine, both men and women, who, for example, have gone on to, say, organize events and where the event hasn't gone to plan, or where they've gone to an interview and the interview hasn't gone to plan. A lot of my male friends or male colleagues have been able to actually go, well, it didn't go to plan, but these were the reasons why. And I've seen instances where women, as you say, will blame themselves. And rather than looking at it as, for example, a woman that I know who was a colleague of mine, she was organizing an event. And the first problem that happened is technology failed on her, the microphone didn't work. Now, she didn't look at it as, well, actually, that happens and sometimes technology does fail. There's not much I can do about it. She looked at it as, it's my fault. I should have done more sound checks. I should have done this. And then she started to blame herself for not being organized enough. And then she had an issue with the food arrived and it was cold. And actually, you can't really control the temperature of the food. If you give an order of food, you expect it to arrive and that it will be hot. So there are certain elements that will be outside of your control. But her take on it, and I've seen this countless times, is to say, oh, it's my fault, this didn't go well, and maybe I shouldn't organize any more events, I'm not good enough. Whereas I remember the male colleagues going, well, actually, the venue completely let you down. The food was cold, and guess what? It wasn't on time. So that's a learn of how can I actually give them that feedback to make sure that doesn't happen again and to actually make sure next event is better. And yes, there are certain elements where you think if you plan and prepare, they should go to plan. But actually, sometimes, and I know this, you can be the best planner, the best organizer. Sometimes things just go wrong, and sometimes those things are outside of our control. Certain things are within our control. So making sure that you get to somewhere on time, making sure that you give the correct address, that you check, you know where you're going, all of that to an extent is within our control. But certain things like technology or food arriving on time, food being hot, to a certain extent, that is outside your control. And you could even do a check before your event, and the food could be hot a week before, and you could love it. And you could come to the event, and then it's cold. So I think women inherently tend to be a bit tougher on themselves. And I think that's driven from society and from the patriarchy because we've often been told we're not good enough. We've often been told, just be quiet or, you're pretty but don't have much of a brain or, so we've had to battle with that, I think, a lot more. And so as a result, we start to sometimes listen to those little voices and they creep inside. So what I want to say to women out there is actually learn to accept that sometimes things are not within your control and that actually it's okay, and it's knowing how to take it on board and actually try and improve it for the next time and not being so hard on yourself.
I think it's such an interesting point because it creates a spiral. It's how it relates to it's how we relate to ourselves in a way, which is something I actually want to ask you about. But there's a spiral where for men they won't personalize it, so they build this underlying inner confidence.
Mm.
Whereas if I think something that's not got anything to do with me is my fault, then it creates a spiral. It's almost learned imposter syndrome, and I think this goes back to my childhood in a way where when I think of myself as a kid, I was really loud, I was really outspoken. I remember I had this idea of whenever I was going to play tennis against other people, I'm going to win. I had this amazing mindset, and I think over the years I was told, don't be so loud, don't be so this, don't be so that, don't be so outspoken. And I went through a period where I then became a lot more quieter, and I used to have these doubts of don't be loud, maybe you're not good enough. And I think in a way I almost learned to have imposter syndrome when I didn't have it previously. And I'm curious about your take on that sometimes it could just be natural, but I think in some cases in what you described, it can it be developed, can it be learned? Have you experienced that from or seen that in others from your time in the sectors you've been in?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And actually, what I've seen in people is when they're told from a very early age, you need to be quiet, you need to take up less space, you need to stop talking now, your opinion doesn't matter, you're just a young person, you don't know what you're talking about. Um, when that kind of negative language is used very early on in someone's either school life, but even early on in their careers, I think they start to develop that extreme self doubt. And you look, a lot of it's rooted in families, like family dynamics. So, where you see a parent or parents who've been extremely hard on their children and actually not used any positive reinforcement. It's all been negative. And even if they got good grades at school, even if they were good performers, even if they were good at sports, even if they were a good sibling, even if they had good comments from their teachers, when it was never good enough for the parents, they have that self doubt. And I have seen that in some of the clients that I've coached, whereby when they talk about their grades, for example, their GCSE grades or their A level grades, they say to me, they're decent. Yeah, I did all right. And you find out they got all A's and A stars. And you think, what is that language? Like, where has that word come from? Why are you saying decent? And I don't have that with any Americans that I've worked with. When they get A's, they go, yeah, I did amazing, or I did really well. I'm really proud of myself. So you're there thinking, where has this language come from? And so when you've either had it from your parents, your friends, teachers, people who are supposed to be encouraging you, even siblings, I've seen it where sibling rivalry is so intense that a sibling will say to the other sibling, oh, well, you'll never be as good as I am, or, you're not even that great, or I'm the star, you're rubbish. So they start to believe that and they take that with them into the workplace. And then, of course, if you're in a workplace that's very tough, very cutthroat, with little encouragement, you can start to believe that. And so when that kind of language is batted around, it does stay with you and it's very hard to shake. And I know, as we said, a lot of people link this to mental health, but it's not even about mental health. It's just about that kind of childhood you had, the kind of exposure you had, the people you had around you. Were they positive influences or were they always negative? And so, that does really stay with someone. And when you look at someone who's had positive reinforcement from a very early age, they tend to have more self belief. And this isn't to say we should never feel like this, because I think everyone feels inadequate or not worthy or not good enough at some point. I think if you've never felt like that, you're either extremely arrogant or you're living in a bubble. So it's healthy to feel self doubt. What's not healthy is when the self doubt takes over and stops you from performing, stops you from getting that job, stops you from actually doing good quality work, stops you from leaving your home, stops you from interacting with your peers, stops you from having a normal social life. So when that is so debilitating, that's when it's a problem. But every so often, when you have those moments of self doubt, as you say, it's growth. It means you're pushing yourself, you're getting out of your comfort zone. But I do think the language we use with children is very important and does affect them later on in life, you know? And this kind of ties in with belonging. And I wanted to ask you about belonging. How important is it to feel as though you belong? And have you ever had instances where you felt, I don't belong, I'm so different from everyone here? I know you talked about politics and not going to Oxford, but have there been any other moments where you've gone, I'm really different, I don't feel I belong, I feel rejected? Have you ever questioned that?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had many moments in my life where felt like that. Even today, when I think about myself, my wonderful family, it's actually a good thing. I've learned to see this as a good thing. Why I really stand out. Now, it hasn't always been that way, and I'll talk about that. But today, I still feel the same way, that my passion for politics, wanting to run, being out there, being an extrovert, I love public speaking, all of these sorts of things, I see make me very different to how my family are generally speaking. But at a younger age, I really felt like I didn't belong because of my grades, because of how I didn't do at school. That I try not to. I was laughing away a little bit when you're talking, because I've been moving into my new home, and I just dug out my certificates that I found from when I did my A levels, and there's some I did really well, and my wife was saying, "Well, what's this grade here? It says unclassified. What does that mean?" I said, "Well, when you don't actually do well enough to even get an E, they give you what they call an unclassified, which is a U." And we were laughing. My brother was chuckling away. That I literally thought that was the end. That was a really hard time, because I thought that was the end. And I look back today thinking I'm really proud that I built a successful business, even though I struggled at school. That it's not a reflection of later on in life. But at the time, people don't know that. And especially as a kid, you think, right, this is it, make it or break it. That I've got to do really well at school. That if I don't do well at school, the rest of my life is going to be doomed. And because you're in an Asian environment, which I'm sure you've seen with a lot of the wonderful mentoring you do, that kids who come from an Asian environment place a lot of stock in how well they do at school. Why? I don't know. I think it's a cultural thing, it's a conditioning thing, that a lot of people have succeeded today don't necessarily do well at school, they've dropped out of school. Whereas there's this idea that you need to get good grades, you need to get an A star. So I struggled. I had all sorts of learning disabilities at the time when I went to school. I struggled with dyspraxia. I struggled with depression at the time. My mental health wasn't at its best, which is why I do what I do today. And when I was going through those motions, there was a lot of pressure from my family. In in the best way. They meant very well, but they wanted me to do well at school. So they gave me extra academia, extra tuition. And sure, the outside changed. They were giving me lots of strategy, but internally, I didn't change. Like, I didn't change my inner way of thinking, inner way of looking at the world, which is then going to create the results I did. So I had a lot of pressure, a lot of stress going to the exams. That I was nervous and I was anxious. That it was, if I had my Fitbit on me then, my heart rate would have been really high. So that's how I was living my life, knowing I needed to do really well. I needed to do well. And because I didn't do well, what I equated that with subconsciously is that if I do well, I'll get love, right? If I do well, my family will back me. If I do well, then I'll be good enough.
Mm.
And that's where a lot of imposter syndrome can come from. That it doesn't always equate to that point, that some people will have imposter syndrome from just the way the mind works. Whereas a part of imposter syndrome can come from areas of your childhood where you felt you needed to be good enough.
Mm.
So for me, that was exams. Naturally, I see all my friends around me do really well. They get, high B's, A's, A stars. Now, I had the capability to do well. I could give you any answer you wanted from the textbook. I was really sharp in that sense, but I couldn't produce the results because of the stress and pressure I was going through, which is what we call self-sabotage, which I see in a lot of amazing athletes and performers, that they're really damn talented, but they get in their own way. And that's a lot of what I went through as a child. So where you spoke about how you relate to yourself, I didn't do well, so then I related to myself that I'm not good enough, and that I'm not good enough created me not doing well even more. And it was a really vicious cycle that I did not like myself when I was 15, 16, 17, 18. That I was very unhappy and I actually hated myself because I thought, if I'm not doing well, then, what matters? I even thought at one point at uni, if I don't get a first, I'm not going to my graduation. That I had that level of pressure. And I felt, unless I get these sorts of results, I'm not going to be liked by my family. I'm not going to be liked by my friend circle who were doing incredibly well. That I even overheard one conversation very innocently from one of the mums whose son was smashing it, A stars, A's. And she said, oh, yeah, Raghav hasn't done well. He'll need to pull himself together and get his act together. And it was the constant reinforcement. Not that anyone did this to me. This is my interpretation. And I take ownership that I created these thoughts. No one has the power to make me think a certain way. I chose to think this way subconsciously without knowing that I need to do really well and get these grades, and that's how I will be good enough. So that's where belonging comes in, that I felt I was outcast. I felt like I just was the failure in all our families and the one that was, yeah, Raghav, he's not the one that's always struggling. So that was really hard for me as a child.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, that was obviously a very vulnerable moment, and you pushed through and you've gone on to do incredible things, and you should be really proud of yourself. If a young person is listening to us now thinking, I don't feel I belong, I've applied to over 1,000 jobs, been rejected by every single one of them, I've been ghosted by most, they won't even give me a reason. What would your advice be to them? Because it's really difficult for young people to get a job. And I'm talking some who've been to top universities, some who do have first class degrees. What advice would you give them?
Hmm. What I would say is that what you're experiencing right now, one day is going to be something you look back on as the moment that helped shape who you are today. That what I just described when I was younger, going through depression, struggling with an eating disorder at the time as well, when I was 16, 17, I'm so grateful for all of that. That today I don't look back at that and think, oh, I got a U, that was terrible. I actually find it hilarious because all of this has shaped me to be the man, to be the coach, to be the husband I am, that can relate to people on a deep level because I've gone through this and I've learned to understand the mind. That had one little detail not gone according to how it was, I wouldn't be doing what I do today. And I find the same with every top performer in the world. You look at the Steve Jobses of the world. The guy dropped out of university and he just saw this calligraphy class by accident. And he thought, this is interesting. I'm going to just drop by and study, even though this isn't my course. And that's how Apple was formed. So difficulty is a very normal thing. Feeling something's difficult is a normal part of life. That if you're living a life where everything is always the same and easy, you're going to get bored. You would actually get bored. That if everyone could build a £1 billion business like that, no one would want to do it. If everyone could be a Cristiano Ronaldo, no one would want to do it. If everyone could be an Ed Sheeran, it wouldn't be that valuable. But it's difficulty that shapes the character, shapes the person. So number one, there's nothing bigger than what you can handle. Every single difficulty you're given is because you can handle it. That's how I believe life works. There's the growth that's going to come beyond the difficulty. So the jobs that you're not getting, the feedback, I remember I was rejected from IBM at one point, and I thought that would be a disaster, and I couldn't be more proud that I was rejected from IBM. So what I would say is there's practical things you can do, but from a mental point of view, the best, to quote Steve Jobs again, is that he had this amazing quote that you can't connect the dots looking forward, you only connect them looking backwards. You can only see how things work out over time once you go through it. And I remember a client of mine's business had completely fallen apart at this point during COVID. And I shared this quote with him, and it's impacted him so profoundly that he's tattooed it on his arm. And today he's got an amazing business. I've seen this with many people who go through struggle, that this looks like your worst time, but it's going to lead to your best time 100% of the time. So I can be practical, but the best thing you can do is just let go, surrender, take a moment to breathe, relax, center yourself, because when you're relaxed, you think better. You're 30% smarter, according to science, if you give yourself a chance to breathe. Start filling your life with things you love while being intentional on the path you want to create. Like, give yourself a break. Like, relax, and you'll start thinking a lot more efficiently, and the good times will unfold. It always does.
Yeah, I love that quote about connecting the dots by looking backwards. I think sometimes we're so stuck at looking forwards and I need to achieve this, I need to get this. But actually, it's looking at what we have already achieved. And as you say, taking a moment to breathe and center ourselves. I think what's been really interesting from today's talk with you is that imposter syndrome and self doubt, it actually happens to everyone. And it's not about incompetence and it's not about lack of experience. It's really linked to performance and it's a mindset. And actually, it's knowing that that will pass and having key strategies to actually help overcome that, as opposed to associating it with a mental health issue.
Yeah, I fully agree with you that it's it's all about how how I see imposter syndrome is what will unleash the best version of me. That
Mm.
I like to keep it really simple with my clients. So just to summarize that it's not about how do I get rid of it, because you can't get rid of it. It's not even about trying to defeat it. I look at imposter syndrome like when I'm in the car with my wife Sakuna. We've got a similar taste in music, but she'll put some songs on that I don't even understand, and I hear it and I don't like it, but I just focus on something else and I forget that it's there in the background. It's just there in the background. It hasn't got my attention.
Mm.
That's how I treat imposter syndrome. That science says every single thought you have will pass in 60 seconds unless you hover over it. And you get 70,000 thoughts a day. So our mind is built to think. So the way you manage imposter syndrome is to realize it's not a big deal.
Mm.
And your body does what it's built to do, which is process the thought. And your mind starts getting focused on the task at hand. And then you get into flow. So when you're not interfering with your own natural process, your own thinking, you get into flow a lot quicker. So it's not about what do I do, it's about actually what do I do less of. That less worrying about what's on my mind, less worrying about imposter syndrome, less worrying about how is it going to work. You just relax, you get into your heart, you fall in love with why am I actually doing this?
Mm.
And suddenly you get back into the zone again. So that's one thing you can do really quickly. But longer term, the best thing to do is keep a log of all your successes. Take some time to look backwards and realize actually, I've done pretty well to get here.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm worried about this board meeting, but look at all these successes I've had that's made me this leader today. Start associating with that person. Start realizing why you are where you are, and you'll figure out the next bit.
I love that. Yeah, that's such great advice. And I know our listeners will love that as well. It's been such a pleasure having you on the podcast
It's been
today.
fun. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. It's been a delight, and I can't wait for our listeners to listen to this. So thank you so much, Raghav.